This program is made possible by funding from the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies, where government leaders, business executives, and academic experts come together to discuss major issues facing the state of Florida.
Hello and welcome to UCF Metro Center Election 2012. I'm Diane Trees, Director of the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies and your host for the evening. This fall, we're bringing you a series of political discussions and candidate forums in an effort to help you decide at the polls. Metro Center Election 2012 is brought to you by WUCF, Central Florida's home for PBS, in collaboration with the League of Women Voters. Tonight, our focus is on the economy. How is the slow economic recovery and high unemployment rate bringing the economy to the forefront of the 2012 presidential election? Joining me tonight to help you, the voter, sort out the economy and the election are journalist Michael Grunwald, author of The New Deal, and economist Sean Snaith, director of UCF's Institute for Economic Competitiveness. Michael and Sean, thank you so much for being here tonight. Let's start out with a question using the states as a reference for the election. We have New York and we have California, both blue states. Texas is red. Florida's the fourth largest state, and you're both Floridians. Why are we such a toss-up when it comes to presidential elections?
I mean, I think really it kind of breaks on the urban and rural lines. You know, you've got the major metropolitan statistical areas. They tend to go more Democratic, but you know, in between, and there's a lot of space in between in Florida. You know, they tend to be more red, and I think it often comes down, at least when you hear pollsters talking to really the I-4 corridor and how critical it is in a state that is as balanced.
Well, you bring up a point too with the job creation. Florida's the 28th in the nation for creating jobs. Now we have a Republican governor, we have a Democratic president. So how are voters viewing this along perspective lines? Is this going to be more of an issue for a presidential race with the jobs, or is this going to be more important when we face a governor's race 2 years down the line? Again, is it a toss-up because...
I mean, I don't think the fact that Florida's 20... I mean, I think the fact is that the economy here is quite bad, and the economy in most of the country is quite bad. You know, so if the election is just a referendum on whether the economy is good, Obama should lose. If the economy is a referendum on whether the economy is worse than it is 4 years ago, then probably Obama wins because 4 years ago we were in an economic cataclysm. But you know, how Florida stacks up against other states, I'm not sure that the voters here feel substantially different than voters in other states. I think it's the same kind of, we've had the same sort of tepid growth you've seen around the country, which is better than the 8.9% decline in GDP that we had in the fourth quarter of 2008, but is not as good as the kind of hope and change that Obama had led people to believe we might be experiencing.
You mentioned the housing market. Do you think that both campaigns are paying adequate attention to the dismal housing market that we still have here? And with Florida, we have one of the highest national foreclosure rates. Still, that's 1/6 of the economy.
Well, you know, we were talking before we came on camera, you know, there's been a lack of specifics in some of these areas offered by the candidates, and we haven't seen, you know, concrete set of steps that are going to be taken. But I think housing, you know, fundamentally is going to be linked to the labor market and job creation and bringing down the unemployment rate and bringing it down by getting people back to work, not by having people drop out of the labor force. So there's an important distinction there. We've seen a decline in the unemployment rate, but that does not indicate in and of itself that the economy has improved all that much. And you know, as it stands now, you know, you need to have a job to get a mortgage. You know, when there's high unemployment rate, you have high rates of foreclosure. So an improvement in the labor market, I think, will in turn feed into the housing market. And I also think, you know, housing salvation may actually come from the same place that its damnation did. And by that I mean, I think that, you know, investors that have pools of money that can come in and buy distressed properties, rehab them, rent them out. That, I think, actually
So buying
is going
in
to be...
blocks again?
We're starting to see that where I live in South Beach. Look, I think the subtitle of my book is The Hidden Story of Change in the Obama Era, and I think in many ways, not only on the economy, but on energy, healthcare, education, infrastructure, there are many ways that there has been real change that people have not been noticing. Housing is something that even President Obama has said publicly that he feels it's sort of been a failure of his administration. And Mitt Romney, when asked about it, has sort of suggested that that really you kind of just need to go through the foreclosure process. It is a very difficult problem for public policy. It's not the sort of thing that there are easy answers, but as you suggested, it is something that neither candidate has come up with any answers.
For stakeholders in this election, who has the most on the table? Would it be business, small business, middle class, the elderly, all of the above?
You forgot students,
education, teachers.
Shorter than average people.
Every election is the most important election of our lifetime, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots at stake, obviously. I mean, these candidates represent pretty divergent paths in some ways as far as the economy is going forward. And we know with healthcare reform, obviously the president, if reelected, is going to proceed with his policies. Governor Romney has said he's going to repeal healthcare reform, although I doubt would be wiped away in its entirety. I think there are some sensible things in that policy that should be retained. Taxes, how do we solve the deficit and the national debt problem? Can we squeeze more out of the 1% and somehow solve our problems? There is a lot going on, and I think maybe more so than in other elections. I mean, 2008, as Michael said, was...
It seems to me that there's a lot more going on, or maybe I'm just more aware of things now. The debt crisis in Europe, that's another factor. It's lingering on. How much should that be taken into account for any economic recovery plan that we have here? And are the candidates addressing that?
Well, one of the interesting stories of the last couple of years is sort of the first 2 years of Obama's term, when he had a pretty friendly House and Senate, was he did pass a big stimulus bill, and then after that followed up with certain tax cuts and aid to states, and even some small business tax cuts that over Republican opposition he was able to get another $700 billion in expansion for the economy, and it provided some, it got us out of that huge ditch and sort of to tepid growth, and then Republicans took over the House in 2010, and it created this real stalemate where Obama was pushing this American Jobs Act, which is essentially, although of course nobody will call it stimulus anymore because the word has become so toxic, but is essentially another expansion, trying to do more public works, more tax cuts, while Republicans have been pushing for austerity, the kind of thing that you saw in Great Britain and Spain that's actually led to double-dip recessions. But so far they've just kind of canceled each other out, where you haven't had more stimulus and you haven't had a turn towards austerity. But I think that's one of the things that's being fought about in 2012 is, are we going to, with there still being a lot of slack in the economy, are we going to try to create more fiscal impetus, or is it time to sort of pull back, which at least rhetorically Republicans have been saying that's what they want to do.
You bring it out in the book that the partisanship has been a key element here. Do you think that we're at an all-time high for that kind of activity now? I mean, we've always had partisan politics in our system of government.
It was pretty bad in 1861.
So we can't claim that that's...
I think one thing that I do think is a new element that I write about in the book, and I was lucky I had really good Republican cooperation, and they really told the story of how even before Obama took office, they decided that their priority was going to be obstructing him on just about everything. And that's created a real disconnect in Washington, where you've had essentially everything has been a partisan issue, and that's not entirely new, but perhaps has been to a new extreme. But you saw a real disconnect between Washington Republicans and Republicans in some of the rest of the country, like at the time Charlie Crist and several other governors who initially supported the idea of an Economic Recovery Act to start off the administration during an economic emergency. where you really have seen this tension between in Washington, where the kind of fear of Tea Party primaries has driven just about everything that the Washington Republican establishment has done. In the rest of the country, you have pretty much the same center-right Republican Party that once supported things like an individual mandate that Mitt Romney had for health care, and John McCain's cap and trade plan in 2008, and even the idea of stimulus, where Romney, of all the presidential candidates in 2008, had the biggest stimulus plan. A lot of these things, as they've been associated with Obama, have just become toxic.
Well, we'll come back to that. You talk about the partisanship in your book. When the Stimulus Act was passed in February 2009 by Congress, no House Republicans voted for it. Only 3 senators, Republican senators, voted for it. Were you surprised at that voting slate at that time? That was right after the presidential election. Isn't that we're supposed to be healing and all friendly? It wasn't that way at all. So were you surprised with that?
I think the president sort of put the onus on Congress to create this Stimulus Act, and I think you ended up with a lot of planks of a political platform in this stimulus clothing, and maybe it was less focused on the crisis at hand and getting the economy back back on track. And I mean, to me, that's kind of was the start of this partisanship. I mean, maybe it was planned all along, but
so you
it
think
seemed
that was
like
a catalyst?
Well, I think the first 2 years, I mean, it was really the Democrats called the shots, and I don't know that the Republicans were brought in too much, whether it was health care reform or the Stimulus Act. And did that perpetuate what was already in place? Perhaps, but certainly continued in that vein.
I hope Sean will read the book, because I do sort of describe how there was a real conscious effort to basically oppose everything. I quote George Voinovich, the senator from Ohio, saying, "If Obama was for it, we had to be against it." That was coming down from the top, and you could tell because, for example, on the stimulus, the House Republicans, in fact, voted for a $715 billion stimulus that was almost identical to Obama's stimulus. It had a little bit less stuff for green energy, a little bit more pork for the Army Corps of Engineers, but essentially, it was never clear why this $715 billion worth of tax cuts and spending was good public policy, while Obama's $787 billion of tax cuts and spending was, the death of American free enterprise and Sharia socialism. I do think that, and then with healthcare reform, you did see that the arc of the Obama narrative really has been driven by trying to cobble together 60 votes in the Senate. There were those 4 months where he did have 60 Democrats after Arlen Specter switched his vote because he had been essentially drummed out of the Republican Party. He became a Democrat, and before Scott Brown was elected in Massachusetts, there were a few months, and that was when he was able to pass health care. But even then, you had a half dozen centrist Democrats in the Senate who were saying, you've got to work with the Republicans, you've got to make every effort to reach out, or else we're not going to go along with you. And so substantively, there were a lot of Republican ideas, including Mitt Romney's individual mandate. It was just that politically, it really has become, us versus them.
Well, I mean, I think another problem is, how much was being pushed forward all at the same time. And when we got the stimulus, and obviously that, was the thing we should have all been focused on. But you also had this huge Financial Regulatory Reform Act along with health care. And so we've foisted a lot of change and a lot of uncertainty onto the economy. And back to your earlier point, I think that affected the efficacy of the stimulus package. I think there was so much uncertainty in the economy that the stimulus did not have the projected impact that Obama's economic team was suggesting that it would. And I think the rules of the game were changing so quickly that players didn't know how to perform.
Well, there has been some discussion and controversy whether the focus on the healthcare reforms or the financial industry reforms really did impact or slow the recovery. So, Sean, are you saying that if that hadn't been a focus, we might have seen a different pace in a recovery?
I think so, because we've all seen this chart that was put out by the president's economic team, sort of projecting the economy with the stimulus and without the stimulus, and then what the actual unemployment rate, the path that it actually followed, and it was very different. And I don't think that it's because the ideas were bad, or that you know, those economists you know, were not smart men and women. They all are. But I just think that when you had so many, you know, different parts in motion at the same time, that the economy was changing, the rules of the game were changing, and when the rules of the game change, the players change their behavior, and that's why I think those projections were not as accurate as they turned out to be.
Well, I do tell the story of those projections in the book, and the first thing you got to say, it was absolutely stupid to put something like that down on paper, where you claim that you're going to keep unemployment under 8%. In fact, unemployment went above 8% before the stimulus even got out the door, which obviously wasn't the fault of the stimulus. It turned out that the baseline, things were just way worse than the mainstream economists thought at the time. You know, at the time, people thought GDP had crashed 4% in the fourth quarter of 2008, which is terrible. In fact, it had crashed 9%. That's a depression. I mean, things were just way worse than people thought. We thought we were losing 400, 500,000 jobs a month. We were losing 800,000 jobs a month. In fact, that prediction they made, while it was wrong on the levels, and this is the sort of thing you can put on your tombstone, you know, only wrong on the levels, they didn't realize how bad the starting point was. They actually predicted that it would add 2 to 3% to GDP, and in fact, the consensus of independent economists that have looked at this has been that it added 2 to 4% to GDP, which is really the difference between contraction and growth. So in fact, their predictions about what the stimulus would actually do to the economy turned out to be pretty good. And as Sean suggested, a lot of this is stuff that most economists agree. You know, you give aid to states that they don't lay off their teachers and cops and cut their Medicaid programs at the wrong time, so that you don't have that death spiral. You tax cuts to more than 95% of the country, aid to victims of the Great Recession through enhanced unemployment benefits and enhanced food stamps, as well as some of these public works. You put that money into the economy, and it does create a certain, it probably, they say 2.5 to 3 million jobs. The real problem was that you had an 8 to 9 million job hole, and that's what they weren't accounting for.
So what you're talking about, the short-term part of the Recovery Act, the 3T test for was it targeted, timely, and temporary? Does that make the short-term aspect effective?
Well, it wasn't perfect. I mean, you know, it was an imperfect bill put together by imperfect people through a very imperfect process, and you know, Rahm Emanuel was in the
process as well.
Very fast process. Rahm Emanuel was in the middle of it, so it wasn't a G-rated process. But it was. I think most of the independent economists that have looked at it have said essentially you had. They've hit every spending deadline. They've had 0.001% has been lost to fraud so far. It was pretty timely, pretty temporary, and pretty targeted. Not as timely as most stimuluses. You know, usually you'd want to get the money out in the first 6 months to a year, but because after a financial cataclysm, you know you're going to have a longer, slower recovery. In fact, it was okay to let things, you know, they didn't have to be instantly shovel ready.
You're bringing up so many things that I want to ask you questions about.
I'm trying to make it shovel worthy, and that's where you get into some of the clean energy, the wind, solar, geothermal, electric vehicles, you know, smart grid, health IT, education reform, stuff that you wouldn't be able to do in a normal stimulus that they were able to sort of, you know, wedge into this one.
Sean, back to a point where you said that so many elements around the stimulus and with the Recovery Act itself, there were so many different parts about it. President Obama did use the stimulus act to actually fulfill a number of his campaign promises. Do you see that as an advantage for fulfilling promises, or a disadvantage because, Michael, as you say, the perception for the stimulus act is not that wonderful? So where do you come out on this one?
I mean, I think it was both. You know, there was a lot of political dimensions to this, and it was sort of constituencies getting, you know, what was promised. So in that regard, it worked. But you know, it also is not largely viewed as a success. You know, I mean, I think the bottom line is, you know, where are we today compared to where we were 4 years ago? And did, you know, the stimulus, you know, deliver us to where we want to be? You know, are we better off than we would have been in absence of any stimulus? I think that's the answer is probably yes. But are we where we'd like to be, you know, 4 years hence? And to that, I think the answer is no.
On the long-term aspects, which Michael, you brought up some of that, the reinvestment, there's been millions, billions actually put into a green movement, sustainable energy, educational reform. I know that it's too soon to, say what a legacy is, but do you feel, or are you seeing that those are going to be effective? That's a lot of money that was put forth.
You can already see a lot of the results. I mean, take renewable energy, which has actually doubled under Obama. Wind power has doubled. Solar power has increased more than 600% entirely because of the stimulus. But and some of this was seen as more of a long-term investment, while in fact the Obama administration has hit every spending deadline. So this was about as shovel-ready as they thought. But it's had other effects. Like, for example, the wind industry was dead in the water in the end of 2008. You literally had wind turbines rusting in the fields. Company Abengoa announced that it was shutting down all its U.S. projects. The stimulus passed. The next day, the CEO announced it was investing $6 billion in U.S. wind projects. And in fact, they've also doubled the U.S. manufacturing content of those projects, so it's been good for factories. It's not a coincidence that right now the fastest growing industry in America is health IT, which got $27 billion from the stimulus. That's going to drag our healthcare system into the digital age. It wasn't seen as money that was, fast stimulus. In fact, some of it didn't get spent till 2011, but it instantly created those kind of expectations where people said, hey, I want to start a software company, I want to start a hardware company that's going to meet that need. Solar power, even though all you hear about is Solyndra, it's the second fastest growing industry.
Sean, is that your assessment as well for the long-term aspect?
You can grow fast when you're small to begin with. You have to look at the base before you, as well as the growth rates. And I think after we experienced the 1970s and all the turmoil in the economy and how energy was part and parcel of that, the fact that we hadn't since then have a comprehensive, long-run, strategic national energy plan, I think is one of our greater failings as a nation. And so yet here we are, still tied to places in the world that are politically volatile. We're still tied to the same fuels that we were tied to back in the 1970s.
We haven't made much progress.
We haven't made much
There's been a lot of
progress.
talk about a strategy for a policy.
Well, that's what this was about. And you had unprecedented, I mean, we had been spending a few $1 billion a year on clean energy. The stimulus poured in $90 billion, and that leveraged more than $100 billion in private capital that was definitely not coming off the sidelines without this thing. And you have seen, unprecedented investments in wind, solar, geothermal, and other renewables. The smart grid, which is now, after it got that jump start from the stimulus, you're seeing utilities starting to take it up on their own. It created an entire battery industry for electric vehicles, almost entirely from scratch. That's now, it's going to have the capacity to create 500,000 electric vehicles in this country instead of doing it in Asia. Again, those are sort of legacies that we'll see over time, whether advanced biofuels in those refineries, whether clean coal pans out. But those investments that just hadn't been made for decades, people had talked about them for a long time, and now they're being made.
Let me ask you, and this confuses me, I see the criticism coming from so many different angles for the Recovery Act. One camp says that that we overstep bounds, the government, and we're going to have dire consequences in debt for long term. Polar opposite comes in and says $800 billion wasn't large enough a stimulus package. It should have been $1.2 trillion or more to offset the severity of the recession that we had. What's the truth?
Well, in fact, I describe in my book how, first of all, he could not have gotten one dime more than $800 billion politically. There were 3 Republican senators and a half dozen Democratic senators who said not one penny more. But yeah, more stimulus would have provided more jobs, more tax cuts would have put more money in people's pockets. You probably would have needed several trillion to offset that entire hole. That said, this thing has become extremely unpopular, the whole idea of government stimulus. A year after this thing passed, the percentage of Americans who believed that it had created any jobs was lower than the percentage of Americans who believed Elvis was alive.
I think you even mentioned it was less than 6% of the American population that view the Stimulus Act as effective.
And that's partly because it's tough to sell a jobs bill when jobs are hemorrhaging, and it's tough to explain that you're spending $800 billion in borrowed money at a time when families and businesses are tightening their belt, even though this is just just an infinitesimal section of what's created the debt. It's also, you have Republicans who have made this sound like $800 billion worth of levitating trains to Disneyland and mob museums and all kinds of nonsense that's not in the stimulus. Democrats who weren't really interested in defending it have complained it's too small, too many tax cuts. And the media, in my business, we've blown the story as badly as we blew the run-up to the war in Iraq. There was really, not very interested in public policy, not interested in chasing down the money. And as a sense, you have this idea that nobody can say the word stimulus, even though Obama is starting to talk about the clean energy and middle-class tax cuts and unemployment benefits that are in the stimulus, but he won't say the S word.
Sean, your assessment of the overall act, is it?
I think there is a fair amount of bailout fatigue in this country, and I think a lot of these grants were going to people with political connections. The bailout of GM, all these things that were happening that also had a political element to it. And then you've got just the average person struggling, with unemployment, unable to make their mortgage payment, underwater in their homes, and seeing some other fat cat get another grant or another bailout. Of course, it's politically unpopular. But back to your original question: is the Stimulus Act the problem with our deficit and our national debt? The answer is no. The problem are entitlements and our tax structure. And I think the president's own deficit reduction commission put out a report that, as far as I'm concerned, was along the right path of what has to happen to solve this problem. I mean, the road that we're on now, without question, demographically and economically, leads to Athens. I mean, we cannot stay on this path.
And the long-term problem is healthcare costs. I mean, that's really the right. I mean, I think that's when you look at the projections for what's going to happen to government spending over the next few decades. Healthcare looks like a ski slope, and everything else looks like a sidewalk.
Well, let me ask you this: we've talked about a number of factors that influence the presidential race. You've got unemployment. Healthcare is a huge part of this. You have the perception with the Stimulus Act. But I was reading an article that said polls are suggesting voters might actually make their choice for a candidate because one is more likable than the other. Do you think that a race of this magnitude could actually come down to likability? Sean, I'll ask you that first.
I would hope not. I mean, this isn't prom king that we're voting for here. This is, a pretty critical election, and two candidates that offer fairly divergent paths. And because one's cooler than the other, or has a better personality, or is funnier or better looking. I mean, I would hope that we're not that vapid as a society that we would vote that way. And we'll have to see.
I was shocked to read that.
Well,
yes,
I think,
Michael?
and I think, let's face it, we know what you're saying. A lot of people don't like Mitt Romney because he has, he doesn't have the greatest, he's a bit of a robotic personality, and he's a sort of Wall Street plutocrat at a time when Wall Street plutocrats are not all that.
There's charisma as a part of it.
All that popular. I don't think that this is going to be a popularity contest, but I do think that, certainly Obama is going to try to tie his Wall Street, his financial background and his tax returns and lack thereof, and his low tax rate to this notion that he's trying to put across, which the basic idea of the Obama campaign is the sort of we're all in this together, trying to portray Romney as a you're on your own guy. And so to the extent that he can tie this kind of sort of wobbly, flip-floppy personality combined with the plutocrat and make that a sort of you don't like this guy and he's not like you, I think that could be something that's very helpful. But ultimately, I think it will come down to what people think about the role of government.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts tonight. That's all that we have time for. Thank you for tuning in to Metro Center Election 2012, and thanks to Michael and Sean for joining us. Remember that Election Day is Tuesday, November 6th. To submit a question for future discussion or debate, visit wucftv.org/election2012. I'm Diane Trees. Thank you for watching.
This program is made possible by funding from the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies, where government leaders, business executives, and academic experts come together to discuss major issues facing the state of Florida.